everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Daisy Jones and the Six Rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut, which is another way to say carpe diem, and it's all about going after the things you want in life. So, something that I wanted to do this year was rewatch the show Daisy Jones and the Six, but this time talk about it with people. And I'm getting a chance to now start talking with cast and crew from this show to learn even more about this show that we've already done a deep dive on. So, this will be another one of these really fun interviews. But just before I introduce my guest, quick housekeeping item. I can't promise this is going to be spoiler free. We could mention any detail from any episode of this show, so just be aware of that up front. If you haven't seen the whole show, it's only 10 episodes. Go and watch it real quick and then come back to this interview. But if you're comfortable with that, stick around because I'm very happy to be talking today with Lisa Clark, who was the set decorator for Daisy Jones and the Six. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad to talk with you. There's a lot to talk about with this show, given that it is a period piece. There's a lot of very specific work you would have had to do. So I'm excited to dive into that. But I think first we need to start big picture and just talk about how you got connected to this show to begin with. How did this job come to you?
Well, the film industry is really built around relationships. And I've been working, a production designer and set decorator often work together as a team. And even though we are technically freelance, you try to travel with the same team from project to project. And the executive producers of this show were the producers on a show that we had done a couple years ago called Little Fires Everywhere. So they brought the show to us. And personally, my background prior to set decoration is I was in a history PhD program. So I love projects that require a lot of research and are about recreating a moment in time in the past. And so I was really excited to be on board for this project.
Ooh, so it all came together for you on this one. Now, I think there could very well be people listening who have a deep industry knowledge, but there are also probably a lot of people who don't know much about the entertainment industry. So I'd love to know a little bit more about your job, just big picture. As the set decorator for Daisy Jones and the Six, what does your job entail?
Well, I would say my job is kind of the equivalent of interior design. Well, the production designer is like the architect, and the set decorator is like the interior designer in terms of being in charge of the items in the interior of the space. But it's a dialogue like between an architect and an interior designer. You work together to create the look and feel of the show. The production designer is the overarching boss in charge of the entire department. And the set decorator is in charge of what I like to call all the character elements. The breakdown it often confuses people between set decoration and props is that props are often things that are called out in the script specifically, like somebody's guitar or the watch they may wear that's character specific. It's usually very important details that are called out that the prop master's in charge of. The set decorator is kind of in charge of the volume of the entire space behind you. So pretend for a moment that like you had to pack up your entire house and move it into another house, right down to the pen cups and with the pencils in it. The set decorator is in charge of all of that for every set. So it's it's a large volume of work and items you're responsible for, and you're responsible for the dialogue between yourself and the production designer to make sure that you have on the same page visually in terms of the interpretation of the character and the space. So that's sort of the job in a nutshell. It's I always say to students that are considering this career that it's a left brain, right brain job, because you have to be creative, you have to be able to interpret a script and a character, but you also have to have a lot of logistical talent. You're managing a department of 30, 40, 100 people, depending on the size of the project. And so you have to be very clear communicator. You have to be good at scheduling, delegating, dealing with budgets. So it's both of those skill sets that you need to do the job effectively.
I have to say that was a really effective way of breaking down what that job is for
Oh,
me as
thanks.
somebody who's not in the industry. So you've already sort of called out some of the roles that you connect with in your job, but
Mhm.
um, are there any other members of the crew that you tend to collaborate with a lot to get your job done?
Well, I mean, everybody says the entire film production is a collaboration. I would say I work most closely with the production designer and the prop master, which are considered an umbrella term that's often used, not always accurately, is the art department, because the art department really consists of construction, paint, design, graphics, set decoration is a separate department, and then props. So those are the people that I work with the most. Um, Also, you need to have a dialogue with the costume designer because you affect each other in terms of the color palette that you're choosing and patterns and things like that. So that's an important conversation. And I talk a lot to the DP and the gaffer because set decorators, more so now that it's a digital medium, really impact the lighting. So we have to have a very in-depth conversation about what types of fixtures and what the lampage is going to be, and are they LED or are they, traditional bulbs like that. There's a lot of conversation about motivating the light in the set because I provide what's called the practical lighting, which would be a lamp, for example. But it helps motivate how the DP may light the scene. So you have to have a really clear communication between those departments in order to give the DP an opportunity to light the scene in a way that's believable. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Okay. So
Mhm.
interesting. So for a job as complex as this, for a 10 episode series with
Mhm.
so many different sets to decorate,
Mhm.
so how far in advance are you brought on board to start a job like that for your prep?
The prep for this show, well, a prep for a show of this scale is usually 12 weeks, 14 weeks, depending on the show. This show was particularly odd because we started it in January of 2020. So we were in prep prior to COVID, and then we shut down when COVID hit, and they shut the production down for almost a year. And we all dispersed and went and did other things because the show, the producers, and rightfully so, were smart enough to recognize that they didn't want to do this show in COVID until there was a vaccine or it was safer to do production because there are sex scenes and you're singing and close proximity and you know so it made the prep a little odd because we prepped and then we shut down and we lost a handful of locations that we had already prepped. And then we had to start prep again about a year later, find new locations and continue on. So it was particularly complicated prep because of that. So yeah.
Oh,
So, but I would
wow.
say on average is about the length of time is about 12, 14 weeks. So.
Mm. Were there any particular, so okay, you have so many locations that you need to focus on for
Yeah.
this. Where do you begin? Like, were there particular sets or locations that you knew to be your first priority, and why were those the priority?
Um, It's a really good question. And without boring people that are not in this industry in too much detail, um, what they do on a lot of these big shows is what's called block shooting. So, what that means is, say you have your 10 episodes. Traditionally, television, you'd shoot episode one and then episode two and episode three, like you would think. But on a big show, sometimes they group episodes together, and the with the idea that hopefully if it's an expensive location you can go shoot it all at once and not have to go back again later in the season. The challenge of that is that instead of prepping at the beginning one or two episodes, you might be prepping four episodes at once before they have a schedule. because the AD often comes in like 4 weeks before and you've started 14 weeks before. So you're doing sort of educated guesses as to what they might start with when you're shooting. So what we did is we prepped the hardest sets first. So the ones that we thought that were very character driven or that were logistically challenging, things that might have really long lead times in having things built or sourced. Um, so we started with Teddy's house because a lot of that stuff was really high end, and the record studio. We started with the band house because it had so many layers. Um, and we started with, believe it or not, uh, the Riot House pool because we had to have period umbrellas made in quantities. If you really think about like, you need 14 of these things, like how long is that going to take to build or make or order from overseas? So we started with things, you kind of make a list of like, what is the hardest stuff? And you start with that if you, in lieu of having a schedule, because the schedule happens weeks into your prep. You don't have the shoot schedule before then. So,
Mm, so interesting. So I do want to, just for people who are listening to this, Lisa, you had sent me an interview that you had done previously with production designer Jessica Kender, and it was
mhm.
a really good interview. And I would love for people to consider that like a pairing with this because we'll talk about
Thank
a
you.
few of the same locations,
Hmm.
but to be fair to the work that you've done, but also I think you both you did such great detail in that conversation that I'm going to make sure that it's linked in the description of this video so people can find it more easily. But we'll try to explore some different spaces and a couple of crossovers as well. And so one of the crossovers, of course, is talking about the Dunn Brothers house and Laurel Canyon. And, it's certainly a key location in the early episodes of this show. One of the details that I really like about it, and it is a sort of a quick line that we get in the script, is how, the owner was an older woman and she had just passed away. And then when we actually get into the house, the like you could sort of see that woman everywhere in that house, just like the personal touches that she had added to it. And I think that particular there was a location and a set with the back house. Seems like a really
Mhm.
complicated project. So tell us a bit about the set deck for this space.
This is an example that is a really good example of how production designer and decorator work together. So, because as you said, it was one line in the script that said something like, they were able to afford this house because the woman died in the house. And that was it. That was all the information that Jess and I had. And through that process, we had a very complex dialogue about who the woman was, even though she's not in the script, because you, as you said, you have to feel that when you walk in the house. And I like to say that set decorators are visual psychologists. So even though, you might not be well versed in set decoration, you are a human being and you can read the space emotionally when you walk into it. All people can do that. And that's what we wanted to create. So we talked a lot about, okay, if this woman died in the 70s, then most people buy their furniture in their middle years of their age, like 30 or 40 years old. So most of her furniture should be dated from the 1930s through the late 1940s. And then people layer on those bigger pieces that they buy when they first are able to afford furniture. And usually they change out, say, the refrigerator or the stove or items that are functional, or they add another layer on top of that of artwork, or they change a lamp. And so the house had that level of layering to it to make it feel really lived in. We thought a lot about who this woman was. The fact that she lived in Laurel Canyon probably meant that she was artistic on some level. So we gave her a sewing corner and we gave her interesting artwork that through the eras. So to me, that was one of the joys of the show, was figuring out creating a world for the actors to play in based solely on this one line in the script. And then showing how that space evolved when the characters entered the space. Because at first, they didn't have any money. So, of course, it just looked like it looks when they walk in. And then when you're in your 20s, you can afford like a throw pillow or a poster. And so the items that enter the space are more affordable, or a few items here and there to make it look more like younger people are living there. And the interesting thing when we did, because we did a lot of research for this show, and we looked at pictures of like Joni Mitchell and her house and Fleetwood Mac and various other, the Crosby, Stills and Nash. And as people do when they're younger, they buy things at secondhand stores, and most of that is cast-offs from your grandparents' generation. So a lot of the research showed that kind of furniture in those spaces in these heydays of these bands just starting out. So we wanted the space to reflect that. So for the back house, which was supposed to be attached to the band house, the location actually had a little cottage there, but it was too tight for them to shoot in. So they decided that they wanted to build it on stage. So we just had the exterior at the location, and the build allowed for them to weld the walls and to get more angles in the space, and they spent a lot of time in that space. But it's interesting. One of the things that people said to me that I took as a compliment is that you can't really tell that you're on a location here and then you're on the stage there, which is what you want. You want it to feel like a visual through line. So, and that space was really important to me, that it felt like a home for Billy, because it was the first time that he really had a home that he created with his partner, and that it was really a nice space to work on. I was happy with how it turned out.
So interesting. And I was not able to tell that, well, I'm not in the industry, but I was not able to tell that one was a set and one was a location. So for me, it feels seamless when I'm watching the show, but I can appreciate that there are a lot of practical considerations that go
Yeah.
into making those choices. So let's go to Teddy's house.
Hmm.
Obviously you mentioned that was one of the more complex things that you needed to get started with early in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that we see it from so many different angles, which keeps it fresh. What goes into working on a space like that for you?
Well, that was a location. That entire set was a location. And that always presents its own challenges. Um, so that character, I mean, I cared about all the characters, but that character I really cared about. I felt it was really important to get it right, because he was sort of the touchstone for the band and the father figure. And we spent a lot of time doing research on Quincy Jones, because that was the inspiration for the character. And we found photos of Quincy Jones's house in the mid and late 70s. I think it was an Architectural Digest. So that was the beginning of the jumping off point for the Teddy character. Um, to me, it was also the one space that we're in where you feel his sophistication, and it's a sexy space, but it's an adult space in a hip, cool way. And I wanted it to feel subtle, like this was somebody who had taste and wasn't just throwing his money around. So we spent a lot of time looking in at Brazilian mid-century furniture, because that was really popular at the time, and search through like a needle in a haystack to try to find key elements to build the room around. I would say also we wanted the space to reflect his cultural identity without hitting you over the head with it. Because again, it's a tasteful space. And so there, if you look carefully, a lot of the art is inspired by African art or is African sculptures, because that's who he is and how he would inhabit that space. The office in the back was also important, where you see Billy rehearsing on the guitar for part of the time, because we wanted it to feel like he actually did work in this space, and but it was still inviting and cool. We didn't get to see as much of the outdoors as I would have liked, because we spent a lot of time creating spaces out there for the action. We only ended up seeing little chunks of it. You never know what's going to make it in the final cut, but you have to commit to creating the whole space. And I think I mentioned in the other interview that one of those touching moments for me was when I met the actor Tom Wright, and he said he really appreciated the work that we did in that space, because that's what you want as a set decorator. You want to feel like you've supported the actor's ability to inhabit this character's world. That's the ultimate goal.
I was just thinking about that as you were talking because your work, you start your work so much earlier in the process, but it happens independently of the actors.
Yeah.
And for a character like Teddy, what you're creating is as maybe as much, if not more, than what's actually on the page for them in the script.
Mm.
So, if Tom Wright is making decisions about who he thinks Teddy is, it would be nice for that to be in conversation with the choices you're making as set decorator. Like, does he just show up and on the day he sees what you've done and okay, this is what I am doing today? Or is
Well,
there more
yeah,
of a
I mean,
conversation?
really, you're counting on the showrunner to communicate to the entire team, which includes the actors, their interpretation of this character. So, although I don't have dialogue with the actors, usually every now and then, if the actor is also an executive producer, like when I worked on Little Fires, I did have conversations with Reese Witherspoon and Kerry Washington in advance, because they were producers in addition to being actors. But if that is not the case, then you're hoping this is how it should function, which is that the showrunner and the director and or writer are communicating their vision. They're communicating the vision to the set decorator, the production designer, the DP, the actors, and that's when it all works, when we're all in sync on the same page. And that's that wonderful feeling of when the actor arrives, you're like, oh yes, we've been on the same page all along, even if we haven't spoken until today. So, and the best feeling, as a designer in the art department is that feeling of the actors showing up and feeling like you gave them more than what they asked for. I just wrapped a show where one of the actors came on who doesn't have a child, but in the story, the character she plays has a teenage boy, and she walked in and said, I can smell the dirty sneakers in here. Like that's what you want. You want the actor to feel like that they've walked into a lived-in environment, and then they can just do their work from there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Let's get into some spaces that I haven't heard you talk about so much. Of course, you said earlier that you consider yourself a visual psychologist to do your job,
Mm.
or that's part of the work that you're doing. To me, something that feels a lot more developed in the show than we would get in the book, let's say, is Daisy's childhood and how the damage that she has from that really impacts like the rest of the show. You can feel it even if it's not called out in the script for the rest of the episodes. But we actually do see Daisy's childhood bedroom play a number of times in scenes, especially in the first episode. Um, we know that she has a really like complex inner life and kind of has to because she spends so much time alone. So I'm curious when you thought about like set decoration for her bedroom, what kind of details were you adding to that maybe had resonance for later in the series?
Well, the way that it was, my memory is the way it was broken down in the script was that there were three iterations of that room. And I don't you probably noticed that the color palette of the show in general is very warm. It's that 70s like orange and browns and yellows and just in her job deals with the overarching like color palette and then I respond to that. And she very astutely picked a cool color for that room. If you go back and look at it, it's sort of like a bluish, mintish green, blue green, because we wanted that space, the house that she grew up in, to feel presentational and cold. So there is one scene prior. Unfortunately, it's like a group shot, so you don't really see a lot of it, but the living room is very presentational and feels almost staged, and that was intentional. It feels very early, like mid 60s. We wanted it to feel like a little stuck in time. Um, and so the first iteration of her room, we wanted it to feel like her mother had curated the room, that her mother was controlling how her daughter was going to be. So the furniture all matches, and there's very, in that period of time, there was not a lot on the walls, and it's very particular. And they're framed ballerina prints, which was also on purpose. The dolls are like ordered. So you can feel the controlling influence of her mother. And through the iterations of the room, you feel her slowly discovering who she is. So the second iteration has a little like she's preteen, she's supposed about 13 years old in that version, and things are starting to be a little messier. There's some scarves like draped across the mirror. Um, she's starting to do little sketches, but there's not a lot on the wall yet. She's put a couple things up, but she hasn't completely claimed the space. So you feel that you wanted her to feel the audience to feel that tension of like her self-discovery and her feeling that she had the right to claim her space. And the last iteration is when she's kind of gotten to the point where she's really rejecting her parents, and you see the rock and roll posters from that era, and some of the protest flyers, and there's a sense of like attempting to obliterate her mother by putting those layers up and covering the traditional bedspread with a pattern from the late 60s. And so that was kind of what we were doing, was to try to show that evolution of who she was. And some of that carries over into her bedroom in Simone's apartment, which you see a little bit of, not a ton. But it's that we wanted it to feel a little chaotic, and like her type of rebellion was through lack of order, because her mother was all about order.
So interesting. And one small detail from what you said was about the ballerina,
Mm.
the pictures that you had. It just reminds me that in the last episode, the one glimpse that we see of Daisy's daughter,
Mm.
um, is her picking her up from ballet class.
Yeah,
So it's I hadn't put that together, but it's like she got a redo maybe in
yeah,
some way. So
yeah.
interesting. Well, you mentioned Simone, and I'd love to explore that character a bit. She exists in the world of Daisy Jones and the Six, but she's giving us a completely different world at the same time. Like she's got a different genre of music. She's in different
Mm.
communities, a different city at a certain point. I mean, it's her story is complex. It's almost like a spin-off within the show.
Yeah,
And
that's a good way of putting it.
she's got like a balance and a maturity and a stability, but also doesn't have the kind of opportunity for commercial success that Daisy does.
Mm.
So, a complex character. Tell us a bit about working on her apartment.
Yeah. So again, Jess and I pulled research for so African American women and men in their mid 20s in California. So we had photos, we had a couple of photos that were really touchstones for us for this character. Um, because I think Simone is a very self-respecting woman. So we wanted the space to feel youthful, but with a level of maturity to of like owning her place in the world. So it's not messy and chaotic like Daisy is. And she has not a lot of things in her space, but things that are curated is the way I'd put it. Things that she likes, that she thinks are interesting, that have an interesting texture or color palette that speak to her and to where she is in her life. We really wanted to get rock posters from that era that would reflect her character. So one of the ones that we had a clearance coordinator who cleared all of the posters from that era, which in and of itself was a huge feat. Her name was Kimberly Pope. And she got us a poster from Sly and the Family Stone, which I can't remember whether it ended up in the cut, but it was those items that really mattered in terms of making it feel real and lived in. So I
Hmm.
was really happy with that environment because it was different. It wasn't a hotel room. It wasn't the chaos of the band. It was somebody that was on a path and knew who she was, but still was young and didn't have a lot of money to throw around. And how would that person make the space feel like home?
Yeah, that character, in I think the last episode is going to have a line about, I didn't know my voice. Well, I knew my voice, I just wasn't used. Like, there, the difference
Yeah.
between having and knowing and not using your voice, I think, is a really important distinction for her in the final episode. And I think it does get reflected in the space because it's the space of somebody who knows who she is, but is very quiet about it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, so interesting. Well, okay, so starting in episode 4, the Chateau Marmont is going to appear in a lot of scenes. And we're going to get different angles of Daisy's room. We're going to get her front door. We're going to get the pool area. I guess an establishing shot out front.
Mhm.
What can you, I think you've already mentioned in detail with umbrellas there, but what can you tell us about bringing this to the screen?
Well, ironically, this was not shot at the Chateau Marmont because they wouldn't. My memory is that they wouldn't grant access to the chateau for the time period we wanted to shoot. So we found a location that had a similar look, and she did it. So we needed a pool, we needed a deck for her to like collapse on off we needed a diving board, we needed a hotel room that felt like a little bungalow. Because the interesting thing about the research that we found of the chateau in that era, because people think of it now as like, oh, it's this hip, cool place that people like go for high expensive avocado toast or whatever. But it wasn't like that in the 70s. It was dumpy. It was kind of falling into disrepair. It was a place where, musicians stayed when they were kind of trying to build their career. So it was a lot of like beatnik, um, hippie flower power energy at that place. So but we wanted to get that feel in the space. Um, I had as part of my team, I had two um, additional decorators who worked with me, and Andy Britton, who I think you're going to talk to, who did the New Orleans portion, worked with me on this set. And again, it's another one of those sets where we chose a cooler color because she's kind of hasn't found her home yet. So there was a lot of green in that space. And as I mentioned earlier, there are little details as a set decorator that sound easy but aren't easy. Like, okay, we have a pool with 10 umbrellas around it for that are, supposed to look like they're from the 60s. Okay, great. Well, there's not like a store where you go buy those. So there were a lot of little challenges like that to bring it to life. I think that it's a good example of a set where there were a lot of logistical challenges because we were trying to make it look like something that it wasn't. So, how do we dress it so they could shoot particular angles and make you believe that we are at the Chateau Marmont, even though we weren't?
Hmm. Let's stay on hotels because once this band starts touring more, we
Mm.
have to get a whole bunch of different hotel rooms and suites for these characters. And I'm curious when you think about that, when you think about sort of the big picture of the show, and you know they're going to be in all of these different sort of like home away from home situations.
Hmm.
Are you thinking about how do I tie these things together for these characters, or are you thinking about how to make them feel distinct? Like, what are your priorities going into those spaces?
Well, the hotels were really an opportunity to show like the narrative arc because they start out really dumpy, like the one where he gets caught getting a blowjob.
Hmm.
And the ones that Daisy and are in at the beginning are a little low rent. And so it charts the success of the band. So that was what we were really going for. We wanted each one of them to feel like they're in a different place because they were in the story, but it was more of a like, okay, this is the lowest point in their career and now they're a little bit farther along and just yeah, charting the trajectory of what the aesthetics of the rooms were. So when you get to the end, those hotel rooms were shot in New Orleans and Andy did those. Those were supposed to look extremely expensive, whereas the motels on the Sunset Strip look like a lot of what you find in the 60s motel rooms. So a lot of those motel rooms, we did a bunch of research. Believe it or not, a lot of really good research for motel rooms is in period postcards because people used to send postcards from where they were staying. So we had a collection of period 1960s and 1970s postcards that were just the motel rooms, and we used those as references for recreating the rooms. And there are little details, one of which I mentioned in the other interview, I think, about how in that time period, the wallpaper and the fabric try to match each other. So there was a lot of attempts to recreate those details, which read to the audience about what time period we're in.
Hmm. Another thing that we're going to see a lot of is scenes inside of Billy's and Daisy's tour buses.
Yeah.
How much involvement did you have with decorating these spaces?
That was a big project from start to finish. And that's a good example of a project that requires a lot of integration between construction and set deck because they were period buses, but they were Greyhound buses. So when we got them, there were rows and rows of like ugly blue vinyl seats in them, and that was it. So Jess did a drawing for where she wanted the rows of seats, where the beds were going to be, where there were sofas, and then we ripped everything out of those buses. And she started with carpeting the floors and redoing the ceilings. We found fixtures that could be embedded into the bus that weren't there before. We reupholstered every single one of those chairs. So I found period fabric for the and headrests for the buses. We built from scratch built-in sofas and a hero bed, which you see for like this long at the back of Daisy's bus. All of the upholstery and drapery treatments were custom made, the curtains, the bedding, all of the pillows. It was from the ground up. Those were a big project. And the other thing that was really fun and interesting about those buses was because at that point in time, they're fighting and they're not getting along. It was part of their contract. They wanted two different buses. So we wanted one bus to feel more like the sober bus, and the other one to feel Daisy's bus to feel like this opulent party bus. So um Billy's bus, the seats are very regulated, and then you have bunk beds, so it's much more a tight feeling, and the sofa in the back is upholstered into the wall. And in her bus, we had much more opulent fabric, so we had more brocades, and his bus is mostly plaid, and so they had related color palettes, but aesthetically they were really different. And we found a photo of Stevie Nicks and her tour bus lying on this button-backed leather sofa. And we're like, that's our touchstone. We're going to build that into our bus and then build everything around that. So it was fun. The buses were fun to do. It's the sad thing about a set like that is it's so tight that you can only get certain angles, but I'm proud of what we pulled off with those buses. It was an interesting challenge for sure.
I want to challenge everybody who's watching this to go back, rewatch any scenes where the buses play, the inside of the buses play, and just think I have had the privilege of being able to start having these conversations while I was doing the rewatch. So when I'd get to those bus scenes, I'd be like, oh my goodness, how did they get lighting in here? How did they get crews? Like, oh, that's a lot of actors in there. How did they get all that? Like, how did they make these spaces look so livable? And it just I think you really feel all of the very hands-on work that so many people had to do to make those scenes functional.
Yeah. I have great crew photos of my set dressers like up, placing the lights and is this angle gonna work? It was a labor of love for sure and a lot of people. So yeah.
Well, are there any other specific sets or locations that you wanted to make sure that you mentioned? This may be something that hasn't come up in previous interviews, but you were
Well,
excited
I
about what
mean,
happened.
I am really proud of what we did at Sound City. I know I talk about it in the other interview, but for those who don't watch that other interview, the most amazing thing about that set is that we shot it in Sound City. And Sound City was where Fleetwood Mac recorded a lot of the original albums and other people like Bob Dylan and a lot of famous rock stars from that era. But when we got to the location, they had ripped all of that period architecture out of the interior. So it was, exposed beams and concrete floors and white walls. And it didn't look anything like it looked in the 70s. So Jess and her team did something that is much harder to do than build a set from scratch, which is to build a set within a building. They had to frame out the walls in order to put the wood slatted walls back up and the fake rock, and they had to add a dropped ceiling inside this building, which is really, really hard. And we got down into the nitty gritty of that space because we knew so much of the action was taking place there. And it was the heart of when the band came together. So we had a book that was devoted just to Sound City, and it started in like 1967 and went through 1976 photographic research. And we pored over things like, where is the ashtray sitting when it's near the sound mixing board, because it can't be too close because then they would burn this really expensive mixing equipment. And where are the stacks of tape and how much older equipment is still in the room? And so that's a set that people look at and they think, oh, you just walked in and shot it. But it was a lot of work to get the details right. So it looked like we just walked in and shot it. So that's a set I'm proud of.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. And when I think about, you mentioned you have like this history background, you like doing the research. Nostalgia is going to be a major factor when you're working on a show like this. Were there any particular pieces in set decoration that felt nostalgic for you personally?
I was thinking about this question before the interview, and nostalgia is a funny thing because To answer your question, yes, but the goal is to make it not feel nostalgic because when you design something with the lens of nostalgia, a lot of times it feels rose-colored and not real. And we were trying really hard for this show to feel believable in a gritty, realistic way and not feel like, yeah, I remember the 70s. It was so cool. So, and I feel like we did a pretty good job of that. But in terms to answer specifically, I mean, a lot of times it's little things that you might not even see. Like, I remember having to find the high chair for the baby. And yeah, I was born in the early 70s and I remember what those things look like. And so seeing the high chair with the like vinyl pattern, like I remember it, and little tiny details like finding the right bedding for the crib and the phones, those little things like that are exciting. They're like a treasure hunt when you find an item like that that isn't that you haven't seen in your life in a long time. It's not a collector's item like a sofa or a really cool lamp might be, but it's those little evocative details that are bring back those memories and also make it feel real. So,
Hmm. So good. Well, you've been able to mention some people along the way,
mm.
but I that you worked with, but I wanted to give you an opportunity here. Are there any unsung heroes on this production that you feel like, well,
There are
people
so
that you
many.
worked with that you want to make sure that you've shouted them out
Yes,
by name or by
yes.
role?
There are so many unsung heroes on a show like this. The people that I worked most closely with were my assistant set decorator, Ray Deslich, who I tasked with dealing with a lot of the venues. So she dealt with a lot of the like the whiskey and Filthy McNasties, because on a project this big, you want to break it down kind of by type. Like, okay, you're going to deal with the Sunset Strip and these details, and I'll deal with the big character sets, and Andy, you're going to deal with the hotels because that's part of the proper delegation. I have two amazing buyers who've been with me for years, Robin Holmes and Yumi Arai. They were fantastic and equally dedicated to the authenticity of this project. And we were lucky enough to we had lots of talented set dressers. And I called them all out when we got nominated for an Emmy. I did like a little post about each one of them. But there was one in particular whose name is Ron Volts, who he was a roadie for Alice Cooper. And so we were really lucky to have him on the team. He became almost like the music consultant when we were setting up things like Sound City or any of the concerts. He could tell us like, oh, well, that's not the right cable. That cable goes here and that would be labeled this way. And you have to stamp the back of the roadie case in this direction. And it was great. All of those people contribute to the final product that gets appears on screen. Like I like to say that filmmaking is a team sport. It's not all about the person, that's the head of the department. At the end of the day, it's a collaboration and everybody has to show up to produce something like this.
So well said. And thank you for sharing some of those names with us and shouting out their work. One last question, and I don't even know how to phrase it because it's been such a strange time in your industry for so long. But like, how about this? Are there any projects you want us to look for? It could be upcoming, recent, past, whatever comes up for you. Tell us what you have worked on or are working on. Interpret this as you will, Lisa.
Okay. It is a strange time in our industry right now. And let's hope for everyone's sake that it resolves itself quickly.
Yeah.
But I mentioned earlier Little Fires Everywhere, which I did previously to this project, which was another really fun, interesting project that was it was challenging in that it was set in the 90s, which was a period piece, believe it or not. but it's a period that everyone remembers. So it was an interesting challenge to try to recreate that because we don't yet have a visual touchstone like we do with the 70s of what that means. So so that was a fun one to work on. And I just finished working on season 5 of For All Mankind, which is on Apple. Hasn't released yet, but I'm proud of the work we did there too. That show, for anyone who hasn't watched it, is an interesting counterfactual alternate history of the space race. And so each season is a different decade. And so for me, it was fun because it's kind of like a period piece, but it's also sci-fi and it required a lot of research. And those are my favorite projects. So I would recommend those from things that I've worked on.
Perfect. Well, everybody be sure to check those things out. And we'll be on the hunt for more work from Lisa as it comes out. And thank you so much for taking this time and sharing your thoughts about Daisy Jones and the Six.
Well, thank you for reaching out to me. This was fun.
This was so much fun. And to everybody who is watching this, go out there. Don't be the muse, be the somebody. Bye, everyone.